The heritage of our church, beginning with the journey from New York, has been documented before by the descendants of those original members, Orrin O.M. Bartlett, whose uncle was Cromwell Bartlett, and Parmelia Stewart Hume, daughter of Roderick and Clarissa Stewart. Their recollections of the long trip from Genesee County, New York, is in a letter by O.M. Bartlett and by Ella Hume Taylor, daughter of Parmelia Stewart. Let me take you back 182 years for the route and experiences of our pioneers. On March 8, 1836, at the home of Warren Buell in Bergen, New York, it was decided to break home ties and establish such a colony with a church and school, with these institutions at the same time to consider the betterment of their growing families. To this end, an exploring committee was appointed. Messrs. Roderick Stewart, Cromwell Bartlett, and John C. Ward was instructed to find a site for a village in the West. This committee started in May of 1836 and went by way of Buffalo, New York, and the lakes to Chicago, which was then a town of 2,000 or less, and a fearful mud hole, arriving there in June. There they met Judge Ford, afterwards Governor Ford, who advised them to strike for this tract of land, as it would be outside the military tract, was of good soil, could be bought direct from the government at $1.25 an acre, and entered at the government land office in Galena. They acted at once upon his advice and came on by way of Dixon's Ferry on Rock River to Brandenburg, which is later called Dayton. They selected a site less than 100 feet south of our present church building. The committee, being satisfied that they had found the best site for the colony, went to the land office in Galena to register this site for our town, then returned home and made their report, and it was decided to make the removal that fall. Before going forth, the colonists preferred to covenant with God and with one another, and did so in the stone church in Bergen, New York, on September 13, 1836, to continue on and become a church in the wilderness. The next day, after the organization of our church, preparations began in earnest, and 6 days later, on September 19, 1836, 5 of these families started on the long journey for the far west. Those travelers, 38 in all, and documented on the plaque in our church today, had 4 covered wagons and 1 carriage, all drawn by horses. Stopping that night at a small town, they remained there over Sunday and held a service for it. It was agreed that no traveling should be done on Sunday. On Monday the 21st, they went on to Buffalo, crossed the Niagara River far above the falls, where they stayed a day just to view this wonder before traveling many days in Canada. The roads were bad, growing worse the further they went because of the wet and difficult fall. They traveled many days in Canada and a few places that they could get groceries. Bread would be set before starting in the morning on the foot stove or baked by the campfire after the day's journey. After crossing by ferry to Detroit, the road was through swamps with corduroy bridges and holes for 30 miles to Ypsilanti, Michigan, one day making only 7 miles. From there the roads were some better, until farther on a deeper than usual mud hole caused the breaking of an axle tree on the Stewart wagon. As it might take some time for repairs to be made, the 2 Bartlett families decided to go on, leaving the 2 Cone families to come on with the Stewarts. So the Bartletts traveled on with some experiences, but instead of going through Chicago, they went through northern Indiana, straight on to Joliet, then Princeton, reaching Wethersfield, which was 20 miles from the end of the journey. But not knowing the way from there, they wandered to Andover, then north to Brandenburg, where they arrived November 3rd. As soon as the others had their wagon repaired, they took nearly the same route through Indiana, but then through the southern shore of Lake Michigan, finally on to Princeton, which was then only a village with a few houses. By then the weather was becoming cold, and it was decided to leave the women, except for one, and the children, while the others would push on and get the cabins ready for them. Two kindly old bachelors took them into their small cabin where they had to make beds and sleep on the floor. The exploring committee, the previous June, had made arrangements with some men to build 3 log cabins, break 100 acres of prairie, and put up hay for them during the summer months, so something would be in readiness when the colonists should arrive. But these men were taken with fever and plague, and were still shaking when the first arrivals came, so there were no cabins or hay and no breaking of ground done. However, the first arrivals pitched tents in the grove south of town while cabins were being built. The Cromwell Bartletts was the first cabin, finished on Christmas Eve, 1836, and Culver Bartlett, the second cabin, was moved into on New Year's Day. Later the Cone cabin was ready, so they went back to Princeton for the women and children, finally reaching Journey's End on January 28, 1837. Finally, 4 months and 9 days after leaving their home in western New York, they had arrived at a new home in the wilderness. We follow these colonists now to their journey's end. They, like the Pilgrims, came to their new home in midwinter, and by sheer courage, endurance, and faithfulness, they later conquered the land, established a Christian community, and had given to us the fruit of their toil and sacrifices. Now, none are now living who came from them, but as we stand here where they were buried, their children and grandchildren rise up and call them blessed.
Katie is the name. Hiram J., born November 15, 1814, Alexander, New York. I, Hiram, the son of John Katie, one of 10 children, and the first of those 10 in 1837 to be on the second group leaving New York by wagon, headed west through the wilderness. On this journey, I carried the pride of being a Congregationalist, strict conservative, abolitionist, and a Republican. The year prior, in 1836, Father John located 560 acres in Geneseo Township, Section 15. Farming this virgin soil, I also made sure I and others kept control of the space north to the river to ensure the passage of slaves to the safe housing in Geneseo. From the farm came the first tree to establish the Geneseo Park. Also, the stone in the northeast corner of the park with the commemorative plaque was pulled by horse to the park. In 1841, I married Mary Elizabeth Bartlett, daughter of Cromwell Bartlett. I farmed until 1881, died in 1888, and I'm buried in the North Cemetery.
I would like to tell you about this very special lady who was such a part of the beginning of Geneseo, Illinois, and our Geneseo Church. Mrs. Eliza Ann Cone, who passed away in June of 1908, was one of the little colony of people who founded the town of Geneseo in 1836 and was a prominent factor in its development and upbuilding along moral and educational lines. She was born in Bloomfield, New York on the 18th of April, 1810, a daughter of Joseph and Cynthia Hill, who had come to the Empire State from New England. When 16 years of age, Eliza Ann Hill gave her hand in marriage to Elisha Cone, and their union proved a most congenial and happy one. The young couple began their domestic life in Victor, New York, where their first child, Harriet, was born, and soon afterwards moved to Leroy, at which place the birth of their second daughter, Clara, was born. Mrs. Cone was converted when 18 years of age, embracing the Congregational faith, while later in the year 1836, her husband also identified himself with that church. They then began to take a very active interest in religion and aided in the formation of a colony to be located in the far west for the purpose of establishing religious and educational institutions. The charter members of this colony convened at the home of Mrs. Cone, where they planned to organize and go west as a church of the Congregational denomination. They were 13 in number, and a little band gathered at the stone church in Virgin, where they were organized into a church by the Ecclesiastical Council. Mr. Cone was ordained as the first deacon. A few days afterwards, on 19th of September, 1836, the little company of men, their wives and children, numbering about 40 persons, started overland for their new home. They located on the site of the present city of Geneseo, which is named in honor of Genesee County, New York, the place from which they had emigrated. The first house, a log structure, was built by Mr. Cone on the south side of the present park and was occupied by 3 families. During the winter of 1837, religious services were also conducted there. The following summer, a tent was erected in the park for church and school purposes, and in July of 1855, the cornerstone for our present church was laid. Mrs. Cone was a prominent, consistent, and devoted member of the church, and her eldest daughter, Mrs. Harriet T. Miller, was the only living charter member left at the time of Mrs. Cone's death. Mr. Cone died at an early age of 43 years, leaving a widow and 5 children to mourn his loss. At the time of the Civil War, his 2 sons went bravely to the defense of the Union, and one of them laid down his life on the altar of this country, dying in a hospital at Nashville, Tennessee. Mrs. Cone was called to her final rest June 4th, 1908, when she had attained the ripe old age of 98 years. Her long and useful life, consecrated to the service of her Master, was filled with many deeds of loving devotion and self-sacrifice, and her memory was enshrined in the hearts of all who knew her.
I was born January 27, 1815, on a very cold and wintry day in Athens, Ohio. I was named Concurrence Ann Gilmore, but everyone just referred to me as Ann. I lived my first 21 year in Athens, and in 1836 I moved to Knoxville, Illinois, Knox County. This is where I met and married a very handsome gentleman named George Richards. We became involved in the abolitionist movement after hearing Mr. Gale give a speech at the First Congregational Church in Galesburg. That city was named after him. We were impressed with his views on the slavery issues, and he told us of another new town that had just been established in 1836, kind of northwest of Galesburg. It was called Geneseo, and it was founded by young families as ourselves from New York. Even though we were of the Presbyterian faith, we decided we would move to Geneseo. There was only a Congregational church in the city at that time, but we learned many other Presbyterians, 16 in fact, and one Methodist had also joined their group. We made our move and joined the cause to help on the newly formed Underground Railroad movement. Elijah Cone was the conductor of the Underground, and he shared one of the standing rules of the Congregational church before we could join. This church will receive no individuals to its fellowship, but such as to believe that holding of their fellow men in bondage or slavery is a sin, and hence are willing to do all that we can to break every yoke. By 1838, the Underground Railroad was well established in Geneseo. We were strongly influenced by the church's religious ideals. We signed the covenant and quickly opened our home to runaway slaves. Our first home was just east of Main Street and Buffalo Street. It was not a large home, so we had to find places in the barn or in our small attic to conceal the slaves. In 1855, we built a much larger Italianate home on the end of State Street, just north of our city limits. It was the perfect spot because my husband and Mr. Munson knew the Chicago Rock Island Railroad would be coming through town, and it was just a short distance from our home. It would be much faster and much safer way to move the slaves that were starving and on their way to freedom than it was by wagon or by foot. At times, there were more slaves living in our basement than we were upstairs. Sometimes we would have as many as 4 or 5 slaves hiding in the basement for several days until it was safe to move to the next safe house. In 1850, at the age of 35, we had a baby boy, but he only lived 4 years. James's death was very difficult for both of us. Then in 1858, we were blessed with a baby girl that we named Georgiana. As she got older, we told her of our mission and what was happening in our home. She helped the slaves by washing the wounds and blisters on their feet from their travels at night through the rivers and the woods on their way to north to get to Canada and finally freedom. Georgiana's job was to wash their feet and put ointment on the sores and blisters and wrap the feet with little wool rags that the church ladies had cut. Our basement consisted of 2 sleeping rooms, a hiding hole, and a hidden staircase. Many times we risked our lives to save theirs. This was a very serious time for people living in Geneseo. My George was a proprietor of the hotel on Main Street, but he also started the Geneseo Stoveworks. We sold stoves from our home, and it was a cover for us going to the train with slaves so frequently. George was also the city board president from 1861 and 1862. My husband and I always took an active interest in our early pioneer community. We were particularly devoted to our church. In 1863, we became charter members of the First Presbyterian Church. The original 16 members who joined the cause to end slavery with the congregational members now were forming their own church, but we always held highly the noble ideas of the congregational church and our congregational friends. We continued on our abolitionist goals until slavery came to an end. We sold our house to Hiram and George Wilson and each of their wives, Mary and Jane, in 1867. It was a home that we cherished and loved, but it had many secrets and many stories about the Underground Railroad. We moved just south of the city limits, and we lived there until George died in 1879 at the age of 64. Since George's death, I have lived with my daughter, Georgiana, and her husband, Mr. Morton, and it is said I had a kind heart for all my dear friends. I sure hope so. I lived a long and useful life, and in my 90th year, I became ill, and within 2 weeks, I peacefully passed away on Thursday, March 31st, 1904. My funeral services were held in the Presbyterian Church, and our pastor, Reverend J.I. Dooley, officiated. An interment took place here at Oakwood Cemetery. But we can say we never held any regrets of risking our lives to save the lives of others. I would like to introduce to you the people who purchased our house. This would be Mary Wilson. Mary?
Let me introduce myself. I am Mary Dewey Wilson, wife of Hiram Wilson. Having moved to Geneseo in 1867, we lived in a gorgeous home which still stands at 205 South State Street. Hiram and his brother George were associated with the First National Bank of Geneseo. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to share some of my background before this time in my life. I was born in Middletown, Connecticut. It was a warm and nurturing place to live, and my quiet and happy family worked together to provide for each other. These were hard times, and it required us all working together just to survive. However, I had a luxury that many young women my age rarely received. I was partly educated at Wesleyan University in Middletown and partly at a private school in New Haven. I took up the teaching profession, for it was of great discipline to rear the youngsters in their tasks of learning. I enjoyed my work very much, but due to changes in my life, I later gave up the profession. In early 1865, I met a handsome, charming, and quite witty widowed man. He was 9 years older than myself and had a daughter from his first marriage. We had our adventures, and I would be most willing to share them with you at a later date. I do hope you will invite me back to hear more of my story. Even though I am a quiet, private individual, I would very much like to tell you some of the tales of my adventures, such as sharing a house with my sister-in-law, raising my stepdaughter and children of other family members as the need arose. Most of all, I want to share my becoming an active member in the First Congregational Church and organizing the Geneseo chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution with my good friend Ella Hume Taylor. I thank you for your time this morning and look forward to our next visit and sharing of my story.
Next, I'd like to introduce her sister-in-law, Jane Wilcox, A Little Difference of Lifestyles.
I am Jane Prouty Wilson. I was born in New York to a family of considerable wealth and social prominence. Because of this, I was able to attend wonderful schools where I was versed in poetry, music, and the fine arts. I always knew I was very fortunate to be part of this family and community. Later, our family moved to Ohio, where I met a very fine gentleman named George Wilson. He was a kind and enduring young man and very enterprising. He and his brother Hiram were both interested in the financial world of the 1860s. Later that year, George and I were married. Our only child, Emma, was born in Ohio in 1864. I was 28 years old. By the middle of the 1860s, America was going through many changes and challenges, especially after the end of the Civil War. In 1866, Hiram and George decided to move to Geneseo, Illinois. George and Hiram purchased shares in the First National Bank of Geneseo. I really did not want to leave my home and move our two-year-old daughter to Illinois. I was told I would learn to love the small prairie town. I must say at first, I did not like Geneseo at all. Later, I learned to love it, and it became my home. It was a good place to raise Emma. The city was comprised of good people with strong values. We made many wonderful, lasting friendships. We moved into a lovely 1855 Italianate home with Hiram, Mary, and their daughter Jenny. Even though it was a large home, two families living under the same roof was not going to work. In 1867, George and I built a large and elegant home attached to the South original home. The home was fashioned with copper and gold crown moldings, Italian marble fireplaces, and stained glass windows from Germany. The home's elegance was made for entertaining. George and I were known for throwing open the doors of our home for lavish parties. Many social events for our church and Geneseo charities were held in our home and gardens. My husband even formed a men's musical group called the Gray Beards and entertained our frequent guests. Emma was our only child. We felt blessed to have her. She was filled with fascination and a love for learning. She filled our lives with joy and love. She also taught us how to be mindful of others who did not have all that we had. Emma was introduced to a fine young man from Kansas City, Missouri. He was engaged in the wholesale tobacco trade. After a long courtship, Emma and Joseph Mitchelson were joined in marriage on July 6, 1886. Because of George and my love for entertaining, the occasion of our daughter's wedding became a particularly festive event. We had Gallagher, a Chicago florist, arrange the flowers at our home for the reception. A caterer, Mr. Eckhart, and his assistants, who were in charge of the reception refreshments, also came by train from Chicago. A large dance platform was built in the gardens for dancing, with the Strasser's Davenport Orchestra playing for the reception dancing. The newlyweds left by train for their honeymoon at Thousand Lakes on the St. Lawrence in New York State. After their honeymoon, Emma and Joseph made their home in Kansas City. Emma returned to Geneseo to care for me when I became ill. Emma and her father took very good care of me until George became ill as well. I don't know how Emma did it, taking care of both of us. I passed away January 23, 1892, at the age of 68. And George passed away December 6, 1892. We are both buried in the family plot in Oakwood Cemetery. Emma returned home to Kansas City after our deaths. She and Joseph were never able to have children, but had a busy, prosperous, and happy life together. When Joseph unexpectedly died in 1911, she was once again heartbroken. Emma moved back to Geneseo, where her roots had been planted in her childhood. Emma met one of her childhood friends. William Goodfellow and Emma fell in love, and he asked her to marry him. Emma married William Goodfellow on November 25, 1915. They had a strong and happy marriage, but Emma never got over losing her first husband and both of her parents. At the age of 58, Emma joined her father and me on November 16, 1922. Her obituary stated she died of a broken heart. Now, alongside of me are the ones who filled my life with happiness and love. We are all once again together on the hill in Oakwood Cemetery, overlooking the pleasant valley we learned to love.